be a toggle. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's your introduction. It's fancy.
It's nice. I have not learned that toggle yet. So.
Hey, everybody, thanks for coming back. Without further ado, the Reverend Dr. Sam Geary.
Okay. We'll try to have a little fun. Okay. Stop 2. Decided to go a little fancier. All right. So do you guys see presenters notes, or you do see presenter notes? Ah, shit. All right. Sorry, I have a filthy mouth. I know that doesn't exist at other places, but
I think we just see the PowerPoint.
you do?
Yeah, not the notes.
All right.
Oops.
That's a bit too far. All right. Hello, Mindy. All right. So you just see the PowerPoint? Shannon? Okay. I can't see everybody, so if you want to jump in, jump in. There we go. All right. Well, good day, everybody. So back to the mashup, right? And thanks for coming back. As a presenter, when people aren't in a captive location, like somewhere for a fall theological education, and nobody is required to be here, it's always nice when people show up again. So even after I gave Shannon way too much crap yesterday, she decided to show up again. So thanks, Shannon.
Tell you what, between you and Bryant, yesterday, man, I just thought about, all together saying goodbye, but I'm still here.
Nice.
I got things to say today, Sam.
Oh, good. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I want to start off by sort of trying to, anyway, ramp up the pressure in terms of the necessity of thinking about this interplay or connection between faith and imagination. And this is sort of off the cuff, but I think we're challenged at the moment, not only in the church, but in sort of American society in general, currently by a failure of imagination. Our imaginations are in some pretty significant country road ruts, where it's significantly difficult to turn out of the way that we imagine the world to be, right? And those failures of imagination are everything from white supremacy to sexism runs pretty rampant still. And, those are two significant things. I think another narrative is one of nationalism, right? Who is it that's in and who's out, who belongs, which filters down into how we relate to those who, at least in our estimation, don't appear as we appear to ourselves or come from the places that we come from. And so this, and we could spend the whole hour listing failures of imagination. And I'm quite confident that you all are more aware of that than I am, given that you're interacting with folks on a daily basis and you get to listen to their stories. And with any luck, they still trust you to tell their stories to you. So anyway, I think, you know, the church is not going to work itself out of the challenge of a failure of imagination. I think the destination that we're called to is faith. But I want to dwell on imagination a bit longer today in terms of, here we go. All right. Yes. All right. So this is just to draw our minds back to the quote from Einstein from the Saturday Evening Post article. Right. I'm enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. And our great joy is, and perhaps our great frustration, is that imagination encircles the world. Imagination, oftentimes, at least when it's associated with Walt Disney or people like Walt Disney, right? What do we call Disneyland? Is called or Disney World, Disneyland are called the Magic Kingdom, right? Which is, sorry, there's children around. I should watch what I say, right? Is BS. There we go. Is BS, right? Imagination is not a always positive, right? Imagination is a descriptive term for how we negotiate life in the world, on the planet, in the cosmos. And it's certainly not all, puppies and sunshine, right? Imagination fuels our greatest ideas, and it fuels our greatest fears and shames. Right? So it's not something, I want to make sure that that's on the table. It's not something that's all puppies and sunshine. Okay. I want to draw us back to Psalm 130 for a moment, right? Which is the Revised Common Lectionary, anyway, Psalm text for this coming weekend. And in particular, I want to draw us to the opening two verses, right? Out of the depths I cry to you, right? So we begin, if we're, reading it responsibly in the context of worship. However, the psalm actually begins, right, with its title, or it might be a title, it might be a direction, it's hard to say. But anyway, it's a song of ascents, right? A movement upwards, right? There's a good bit of conversation, let's say, in scholarly circles as to what these 10 or 15 psalms are in this section of the Psalter that all begin a song of ascents. But I think in some sense there's an agreement that it's a direction of the self towards God, right? An opening up, right? How one thinks about that in association with the temple is up for debate. But anyway, it's sort of this movement, right? And when I think about it, I think of, the prayer, let my prayer rise up as incense, O God, right? That we sing, excuse me, and hold an evening prayer, right? That these psalms are in that sense, right? Like the smoke wafting up from the candle or from the incenser, as a movement to God. And the juxtaposition of the title of the psalm and what we call the first line of the psalm catches me as a bit of a whiplash, right? We have this song of ascents, and the place from which the song of ascents rises is out of the depths, as deep as one can go, right? The sheer hama'alot, right? The song of ascents rises up of the makim, right? Or the depths of the sea. And the verbal root that undergirds, right, or provides sort of the joists underneath the floor of makim, right, or the depths of the sea, right, is amak, which is to be deep, right, or mysterious, sort of veiled even, right? And so I have this picture in my head, right, of this perceived distance or gap between my human situation as a prayer of this psalm and the one to whom I pray. Right? Sort of this massive chasm, right? Right? If the Lord is in the highest heavens, right? And I am in the depths, sort of veiled in somewhere below Davy Jones' locker. How about that? Right? Right. You know, if we think about the human condition, right? How is it that we imagine ourselves in relation to God? Right? Yeah. We'll come back to Psalm 130 in a moment. Right? How is it that we imagine ourselves? Or, you know, think about this thing. I'm going to try an aside here. So, right, if we're preaching as if the windows in our churches aren't open, this is all just a waste of time, and we should close up shop and join the Kiwanis and work at Walmart or something, because Kiwanis or any service organization does stuff more efficiently than the church does, right? So a question is that how do we engage folks who feel disconnected from the ground of being, right? From meaning, from life itself. As you all know, there's been spikes in despair, in depression and anxiety. The spikes started significantly before the pandemic, but the pandemic was like fuel on the fire for this, right? And so I'm not asking you to preach the gospel to people who aren't in the pews, but preach as though the windows are open and the whole town can hear. One of my prayers every week is that, and I'm sorry for folks who aren't Wartburg grads, but I sort of think of this in terms of a prayer for my students, which I'll now include you in, right, in that sort of cloud of folks. Is that I pray that somebody every week, somebody will wander in to worship, not having any idea why the hell they're there, but just wander in for whatever reason, and that they might hear something that touches them in the depths of their soul. So we'll come back to Psalm 130, but as a exercise in sort of imagining this, I was drawn to some time ago a poet, a priest. I think he was a former. He spent time as a priest at Gethsemane Abbey, which is where Thomas Merton was, and this was back in the 50s. So Merton was one of his people. But the guy's name is Ernesto Cardenal, right? And he rewrote, or paraphrased, I should say. He paraphrased these first verses of Psalm 130 in this way. From the depths I cry to you, O Lord. I cry in the night from the prison cell, and from the concentration camp, from the torture chamber. In the hour of darkness, hear my voice, my SOS. And Cardinal, again, a priest and poet, was moved to leave the abbey. I think he moved to Nicaragua to be in the parish in a different way, right? But how do we let our imaginations wander with the text into the world in such a way that that the depths, the ma'amakim, right, become real? The ma'amakim are not abstract places, but they're real, everyday, tangible, dusty, dirty places of existence. So, Einstein's statement, right? Imagination encircles the world. Right? Right? Imagination encircles the world. Imagination is a powerful aspect of our human existence. Perhaps the most powerful. It allows us, it allows us to go places that we haven't been, right? To know people that we haven't known, right? And as much, right? Imagination brings us into some of the scariest places, right? That we know, right? We come to know. Anyway, right? So, the idea that imagination encircles the world, I like to think about this in terms of, Einstein, I think, imagined the cosmos, but I want to put out there that if we bring this idea, right, into juxtaposition with Colossians chapter 1, right, the use of tapanta, right, or all things in the Christ hymn, right, grammatically tapanta, right, the Greek tapanta, there's nothing that exists outside of that neuter plural, right? It just grammatically is impossible to find an exception to the everythingness of it, right? And so in some ways we're moving towards thinking about imagination encircling the world in light of the Christ hymn, right? And that then seeps into every aspect of our being. But as we move in that direction, I want to think, have us think for a moment about this powerful aspect of our human existence, perhaps the most powerful aspect of our human existence, and ponder how imagination takes shape, right? Or how imagination matters, right? And there I'm playing on words. If you can't see it in my face or hear it in my voice, I'm playing on words, right? It matters. That is, it has meaning, but is also, there's a stuff to our a stuffness, right? A thinginess to our imagination, right? So how does imagination take shape, right? Well, imagination takes shape. And I'm curious, actually, I'm going to pose this challenge, right? Beyond the things that throw at you, I'm curious, what other ways do you imagine imagination taking shape, right? So hold that question next to you, and we'll pause for a moment in just a bit to consider it, right? So I would say that imagination takes shape first and foremost within the fabric of language, right? Building on observations by folks such as Hans Georg Gadamer and David Tracy, using the language of the latter, right? He says this: we belong to our language far more than it belongs to us. Right? This is part of our humanity, right? That we in fact belong to the system of language in which we live and move and breathe. Right? It is the fact that we can manipulate it, right, suggests that it's ours. But in fact, if we manipulate it so much or too much, it ceases to be valuable, right? It ceases to matter because it doesn't communicate anything to anybody, perhaps but ourselves, right? We don't when we're children, although I think some twins, right, have been shown to have this happen, right? We don't develop our own language, right? The world is not full of individual human beings that develop their own individual language. We become part of the language, right? And languages are specific, right? Language and culture are intertwined. Consider the epistemological and imaginative value in learning a second language, right? Right. For example, coming back to Colossians 1, right? When you read all things in English, right? My brain doesn't have too far to go to say, oh, does that really mean all things? Or what's the antecedent of things there, right? Whereas in Greek, right, there is not the language itself limits our imagination to find an exception to the rule or exception to the tapanta, right? Our language in many ways is the fabric, it's the stuff of our imagination. And when we learn a second language, quite literally, another world opens up, right? Yeah. When we consider language, right, I want to also include in this the language of mathematics, which I think is a language. And I want to hold close, but not quite equate with language per se, the arts, right? Music, dance, sculpture, icons, painting, printmaking, right? These aren't languages on their own per se, right? But they are interpretations of or representations of truth or beauty that operate on a certain par with language, right? That transcend individual languages and move from one language to another. So our imagination takes place within the fabric of language. Secondly, it's fueled by metaphor. Donald Davidson, who's, I'm thinking now he's retired, he was at the University of Chicago, said that metaphor is the dream work of language. And no, I don't want to get into Freud and psychoanalysis. That's way, way out of my depth. But, right, when we think about the subconscious work of the mind, right, how, it puts what our logical conscious minds might not locate next to each other, it will readily put next to each other things that don't belong together in our logical conscious minds, right? And it, in that sense, it's our minds, right, trying to create meaning out of the chaos in which we live, right? Metaphor is a similar sort of thing, right? Metaphor is the dream work of language, right? Paul Ricoeur talks about how metaphor, right, it is the creative genius of language, and it does so in this way, right? Metaphor puts two unlike things next to each other, and in that space between those two dissimilar objects, something new is created. Right? Something new is created. Excuse me, trying to get this hairball out. It's not happening. Right. So, metaphor is around it. In fact, words themselves, right, as symbols for other things, which they are not, right, are indeed metaphors on a very base level, right? So, this one, right? This, I don't know if anybody can see me. This is a beaker, right? It's holding water, okay? Or mug. No, this is a mug. Sorry, this is a mug, right? Holding some tea, right? When I say, right, the word mug to you, that word is not itself a mug, right? It stands for a mug, right? It stands in relationship to that which it is not. And in that creative interaction between the thing and the word which is naming it, you have this generation of an idea, right? The idea transcends the physical object, right? And a mug, I could call something else a mug, right? In fact, I have another mug here, which I know what it is because it's in relation to. Okay. So, right, yeah. There's a fellow named Arnold Modell, right, who's a clinical professor of clinical psychiatry at Harvard, and speaks of metaphor in this way, in concert with cognitive linguistics. Right, he says this, right, that metaphor exists as a mapping or a transfer of meaning between dissimilar domains, right, from a source domain to a target domain. Metaphor not only transfers meaning between different domains, but by means of novel recombinations, metaphor can transform meaning and generate new perceptions. Imagination, this is still him, imagination could not exist without this recombinatory metaphoric process. Right? Imagination could not exist without this recombinatory metaphoric process. Right? That is, right, we are, as human beings who operate within the fabric of language, right, we're constantly operating with metaphor. Right? It's not only, it takes a certain shape when we think of literary devices like metaphor and simile, right? It takes a narrative form when we think about things like parables, right? Jesus' parables, but it's part of our everyday, ordinary, pretty much unconscious negotiation of the world, right? That we negotiate the world in some ways through metaphor, and imagination exists because of this tension, right? This holding together things that are different from each other, and it's the transfer of meaning between the two, the tension between the two, where creativity happens or imagination happens. Okay, right. So contrary, right? This is, we'll call this an academic dingleberry, right? Contrary to Aristotle's understanding that metaphor was mere decoration, right? In terms of, to fancy something up, right? Metaphor, I think, is actually part and parcel of who we are as human beings, right? And with it, imagination is part and parcel of who we are as human beings, right? So imagination takes shape within the fabric of language. It's fueled by metaphor. And thirdly, it's carried along by narrative. It's carried along by narrative. Right? We live in and out of story, or perhaps more accurately, stories. I don't think any one of us operates out of a single story, right? I think human beings are just fundamentally more complex. Right? Individually, our narratives, our stories are shaped by experience and by memory, by the stories shared with us, by the stories the earth and its ecosystems carry, right? By the stories coded in our DNA, by the cultural narratives that we are, both wittingly and unwittingly, a part of, and which are a part of us. We are a mashup of stories, right? With some of those stories being dormant, right? Or, well, yeah, let's just say dormant. And some of those stories being operative and directive, right? Determining how we understand ourselves and our place in the world, determining how we act and relate to others. Our stories, right, that we're made out of, orient us to the world, to space and time, right, to other human beings. You imagine, right, somebody whose operative story is one that is a story of anxiety, right? That operates in such a way that it's not only a physical reaction, but it orients you towards the future, right? In a way that can be crippling to the present. These stories have power, right? The stories of our lives have power, right? We as human beings are not powerless in relation to the stories, but we have to acknowledge that the stories themselves have power. As the narratives help us, right, negotiate whom to embrace and whom to fear. Right? These stories have power in that they help us form and calculate meaning, value, and truth. How is it that you believe somebody when they tell you something? Well, it operates out of a narrative, right? How does that person, who is that person in my narrative? Right? Should I believe that person? Should I trust them? Right? Some of these narratives are deeply personal, right? Some of them are hidden or unaware of them. Sometimes they're subconscious. Some of these narratives are public and ritualized, right? Memorial Day, right? Memorial Day, Holy Hannah. I had a weird experience on Memorial Day. I shouldn't, weird is a value term. It was an interesting experience, right? I'm a bagpiper, and their little bagpipe band played at a place called the Belvedere, a mansion in Galena, Illinois, built in like 1857. The guy who built it was a good friend of Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln, and there's all kinds of stories. Anyway, he was a pallbearer at Lincoln's funeral. This guy, right? So he's a mucky muck. But we were out in the garden playing for, I don't know, 50, 60 people, something like that. And the guy who curates this place, this house for visitors, introduced us, right? And it was amazing to me because he started off by naming, and I don't remember now, 360 some thousand war dead from the Civil War on the Union side, right? And that in and of itself is a factoid. There's no big, I don't know, it's just a factoid. It's part of reality. but the guy choked up and started crying. This is not me making fun of the guy for crying. It's not it at all. But the story, and he was dressed in period costume and all that sort of stuff, right? And I don't think he was BSing us, right? It was a genuine emotional response, right, to an event that's now over 140 years ago or something like that, right? Right. There's a narrative in which this individual is living, right? That at the mention of this massive loss of life due to civil war brought him to tears. Right? And, this, I would call that a public narrative, right? So the narrative of the war, right? Of this Memorial Day, of the sacrifice, what people would call the ultimate sacrifice, right? In defense of the Union, of freedom, etc., etc. Right? We ritualize this with our Memorial Day celebrations. Right? So, as human beings, our imaginations, right, are not always bound by, but our imaginations are often carried along by the stories in which we live, right, that make up our lives. Right? We do have the capacity, in some sense, right, to rewrite these stories, right, to retell them. Okay? Yeah. And that can go either way, right? And some of you may remember this. There was, in a class that I was a part of for a long time called Faithful Responses to the Isms. We would have a guest speaker who would come in, two guest speakers, but one of them would always bring a photocopy of a textbook. I think it was Houghton Mifflin, but it was a U.S. history textbook that would show an image of the southeast of the United States, and the image was a graph telling us, it was about immigration, right? Immigrations in terms of the roots of the country, right? And it represented, right? And it called folks who came here by no agency of their own, that is slaves, right? It referred to them as immigrants from Africa, right? I would call that not necessarily a positive retelling, right? But a twisting, right? Of the story, of the narrative, right? In a textbook for children, no less. So it's an infuriating one. So I think, as we think about imagination, right, that we are indeed imaginative beings, right, by our very nature, right, that this imagination takes shape within the fabric of language. It's fueled by metaphor. It's carried along by narrative. Are there other ways, right, or responses, thoughts? Be curious. Are there other ways that you think imagination takes shape in terms of our human experience?
I'm kind of curious from
Yeah.
your expertise in the Hebrew Bible,
Mhm.
as well as our Lutheran theology, obviously, what you make of this theologically when, in my mind, I'm thinking imagination actually pre-exists everything. So what does it mean because we say that language pre-exists everything. I mean that there's the eternal word that then is spoken into existence, that speaks things into existence. And so the sort of what's I guess sparking my imagination is trying to think about the the relationship between imagination and incarnation,
Mhm.
and how we kind of dwell, our minds allow us to dwell in both of those realms. That I can live in the world of imagination where I can conceive of things that don't yet exist, and then I can also bring them into existence either by language or by the process of creativity, of creation. So I don't know, that's kind of where my mind went. What do you think about that?
That's the destination I'm going, man. So, yeah.
Well, good, it means I know you pretty well. You must have taught me well,
I don't know.
or we're both
Maybe-
crazy, that's it.
Yeah.
But I have a prayer. As you were speaking, I have a prayer above my desk, right below a picture of the beloved castle at Wartburg Theological Seminary. And it's the prayer of Saint Teresa of Avila. And the phrase that's stuck out to me today is the third line that says, "May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith."
Right.
And that's an invitation to imagination. If there are infinite possibilities that are born of faith.
Right.
But there's also terror in that, of like, well, that means if there are infinite possibilities, some of those possibilities might not be so good.
Exactly. Right. Yes. Yes. I'll come back to that, Brian. Yeah.
I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea of arts being an extension of language, because I don't know that you have to have language to have art. I think that in their own way, they help imagination take shape. And I think of, watching children play or interact with music, dance. They don't have to have language in order to do those things.
Yep.
And so I think we use language to maybe enhance or understand art, but I don't know that I don't know that the language has to come before the art forms, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think different forms of art could be a more true shaping of imagination than even language. I think there's less limitations, there's more possibilities. I think sometimes language can be, it has its own restrictions.
Yeah, definitely does. Yes, language controls or closes our imagination as much as it opens it. Yeah, for sure.
Well, it's about the interpretation of the language being used, right?
Same
I
way.
mean, well, I could say something, and this kind of relates to our preaching, that 14 people could hear it in a different way.
Mhm.
So I think how we say things then becomes just as important as what we're saying.
Indeed.
Maybe this gets us back to the idea that, like, what exists before the language even is some emotion or some experience or that language is sort of the thing that we're using to try to make meaning out of that and bring some concreteness to it so that we can understand it more. But behind every form of communication, whether it's art or dance or music or speaking, or is some sort of emotion that you're trying to get across, that you just have to get out somehow. I just have to express this somehow.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the universal thing behind it, is that some of us express those emotions really well through speaking. Some express it through art, some express it through other languages, but there's this sort of universal, just like, maybe gets us back to Psalm 130 of "out of the depths I cry to you." Of just like, this is my cry into the abyss of, I don't know what else to do, but there's something within me that just has to cry out in some form of language or expression.
Yeah, I'm pondering the concept of play, perhaps. Right. Yeah, I got to think about that more. But I hesitate to say, is there understanding outside of language? Right.
I think there is understanding outside of language, but I don't know if the expression or the way we communicate about it then is, I still don't know if we need language for that. That was my struggle too. I love these 3 points
Mhm.
because I love words. But I also love silence and the art with lack of words. And then I was thinking, I'm taking an Enneagram course right now, and I identify with a 4, which is someone who like feels all the feelings and often gets stuck in reacting to and feeling imaginative things. So I'll start imagining a possible future or something that could, and then I'm like actually feeling as if it's happening. And so then I'm wondering with imagination, can we come back to the present moment and have some more healthy imagination? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm playing with that right now too.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. Matt, I think that being imaginative beings to the core, like fundamentally so, right, that our imaginations are constantly impacting our negotiation of the present, right, whether consciously or not. Yeah. I mean, we had I shouldn't say we, our pastor had a funeral for a 12-year-old girl who died in an ATV accident here, say a month ago or so. You know, and just talked to him a little bit about this, and you know, it occurred to me again, you know, when a child dies, right, and not limited to children, but just thinking about this specific instance, when a child dies, you know, there's a relationship that's severed in terms of, you know, the physical relationship with your offspring, thinking as a parent. But it's not only that sort of physical day-to-day relationship that's severed, it's the future, right? It's a conception of the future that's severed. And yeah. And where I would like us to go, and probably get there tomorrow, is, you know, how do we think about the reconciliation of the imagination? Right, because imagination unreconciled is, you know, it can be a positive thing, but it can be destructive, right? Eugenics, right? Or sort of the science, or what, pseudoscience of race, right? That you know, reached a certain zenith during the Third Reich, right? Was an imaginative exercise, right? Yeah, it was an imaginative exercise that that got traction in the present, in a very frightening and destructive way. Yes. So let's, yeah, can jump in anytime. All right. I will think about it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where this.
Matt.
Hello.
Hi, Matt.
I don't know where this lands, but everything that you and other folks have talked about. I mean, when a word is in some ways used as a weapon, or it's enough people, because what Shannon was saying, like 14 different people can take 14 different takes on something. But what happens when a whole group of people decide to take a word and and change its meaning in some ways. And then you can't use that word the same way that it's been used in the past. Connecting with your textbook,
Mhm.
example a little bit. I mean, they reshaped that word, or we're trying to reshape that word of an idea of immigration, which just didn't relate to reality, right? But in the political sphere, where people can co-opt a word in some ways, and enough people get behind it that there's such polarization based just on one word.
Right. Yeah. Or even a symbol. I'm a hardcore independent. I remain a hardcore independent. But we live on a street of hardcore Republicans, and not just Republicans, but Trump devotees, right? And the symbol for that has become, at least around here, and saw it in January when I was traveling around the West, is a big ass American flag, right? That there's a communication if you have a big American flag in your front yard. My one neighbor just got a new one. It's really pretty. Right, that communicates, well, and here we're moving into the theological, that communicates that I'm part of the righteous narrative, right? The righteous narrative, right? And I symbolize that, or I reveal that to the world with this flag, right? But the flag has never been something that's been owned by any particular party, at least in my recollection. But there is an ownership of it now, which is different than 5-6 years ago. So then, to your point, Matt, I've thought about suggesting to my friends who are Democrats of having a sort of massive flag buying campaign. Everybody put a flag out and just confuse the hell out of the matter, as a way of sort of turning the co-opting of a symbol, right, or the narrative that it represents upside down. But that's just me rabble-rousing, perhaps. I want to hit a couple other things before we hit 1 o'clock, which is coming up really quickly here. Right. So I want to take the word imagination and morph it for a moment into the word wonder, right? And you can see in the background there, katamathete, right? The consider, right? The ponder, from Matthew 6, right? I'm going to assume from this point on that human beings essentially negotiate the world through wonder, right? This wonder might, over years and time and experience, become jaded or co-opted by dominant narratives, but in essence, we operate through wonder, right? And this wonder then is rooted in language, fueled by metaphor, carried along by story, and perhaps carried along by art and play as well. I think you got me thinking. Thank you. Right now, I want to make sure that, given Einstein's comment, I want to make sure that I say loud and clear, I'm not downplaying the value of science or scientific inquiry, right? The impulse to explore and to create leads us two-legged meat sacks that walk the planet down the path of curiosity and science, right? Down the path of discovery and invention. So, just consider the fact that we have a robot on Mars that's like taking panorama pictures, that the Hubble Space Telescope, right, has images of light and energy that echo very nearly from the moment, or shortly, not the moment, but shortly after the moment of the Big Bang, some 13 billion years ago. Not to mention the fact that we're approaching a moment of singularity in the advent of general artificial intelligence, but that's another rabbit hole that we shan't go down, right? Anyway, this is not to devalue science at all, right? But it's important to spend a couple minutes touching on the location of biblical studies and theology in the academy, as the academy has evolved over the last 250 years. Right? So biblical studies and theology have been zip-tied to reason and experience for some time now. The influence of Wissenschaft, right? It's not only Germans, but sometimes it's helpful to use a German word, right? Wissenschaft, right, or academic scholarship that has held sway over theology and biblical studies since sometime early in the 19th century, at least, right? In biblical studies, excuse me, we see a clear shift from the study of scripture to biblical studies, right? Shift from a study of scripture to biblical studies. The biblical text becomes something to dissect rather than something that dissects, right? Something to explore as artifacts in a museum, as opposed to things which put a question mark in front of our existence or behind our existence. The biblical text becomes an artifact of bygone eras, cultures, and contexts. Oh, and there's 1 o'clock, right? And the meaning or truth of the biblical text gets zip-tied to a reconstructed history, right? Actually, it's 1 o'clock, right? Maybe we'll come back there, right? What I want to do is spend a couple minutes thinking about how the way that we do theology and the way that we do biblical studies, or the way that we study scripture, has indeed impacted our imagination, right? And then finally, tomorrow, move to faith. So, sorry to end abruptly like that. I've learned, I don't know if it's Zoom or if I've always been this way, but I really suck at keeping time. Really suck at keeping time when I'm in Zoom world, which does not ingratiate oneself to people that you're talking to. So anyway, yeah. Thoughts, questions before I say farewell for another day. Sorry, Laura, right up to time.
Don't apologize if people are, they'll log off if they gotta go. So any final questions or thoughts?
I always have final thoughts. I just had one last comment to make. I really appreciate this because this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I have an atheist friend that likes to post, things just to kind of poke at me sometimes with things about the flying spaghetti monster and all of that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
And I finally wrote back to him and I said, you keep bringing up this flying spaghetti monster like it's an insult to me, but I actually think it's an insult to flying spaghetti monsters, because I think the world needs a lot more imagination, not less of it. Like what does it mean to think of a flying spaghetti monster? That's okay. We can consider that. So
Yeah. A positive comment towards flying spaghetti monsters. I love it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But that somehow a person of faith is not imaginative. That's what that you're very doctrinally rigid and that
Yep.
you've closed off your imagination to all sorts of other things.
Right.
That's the perception. And I think we just have to resist that. Not fight against it, but just open ourselves up.
Yep. Right. And that, you know, in many ways, this is the challenge before the church, right? And I don't necessarily mean any particular congregation, but the church ecumenical, at least in North America and the US in particular, comes off in public as very lacking in imagination. I can't imagine that God would love so and so.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with we don't want to think too hard about it because we'll find the holes in it. If we think, I had a conversation with somebody about, there was a woman at their Bible study that was upset because they were talking too much and not reading enough scripture. and I was like, well, like, I mean, what do you think a Bible study is? Like, I mean, if you're just going to read scripture, like that's one narrow interpretation and view of it, like whatever. But I mean, yeah, when we talk about it, we open up our imagination to what it could be and what God's doing. So I don't know. I like imagination. I got all kinds of stories going up here, Sam.
Oh, get me going, Shannon. Yeah. I mean, and the challenge of community is that if we risk sharing how, you know, how we're imagining something to be, right? That comes into contact with the imagination of others, right? Or the projected imagination of the biblical text. Yeah.
That's why you need to be Lutheran and just go, you know what, we're all wrong. We get it wrong all the time. There's freedom in that. Just say
Yeah.
you're wrong and trust in God's grace. You have freedom to be wrong.
Yes. Right.
Anyway, I got to go pick up my daughter from school.
Yes.
See you guys.
Cheers. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks again for coming back. We'll see you on the flip side tomorrow. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow. Thanks, Sam.
Betcha.